Were you alive when the war started? If yes, type yes, I was alive in the comments. Let's see who was there. After this video, watch 2 or 3 more long videos on our channel or on YouTube. You may receive good news in 2 days. If you do, come back and comment, we receive good news. Like and share this video with your friends. Let's get started. 23,000 feet above the frozen spine of Germany on January 17, 1944, Staff Sergeant Michael Hendricks feels the air thin enough to kill and the temperature at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cramped waist gun position of a Boeing B-7 Flying Fortress, lonesome PCAT, he sees his breath turn to ice particles hanging in the pressurized chaos. Through the open gun port, the world below is a monochrome nightmare. White snow, black forest, gray smoke rising from Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. The formation around him is a constellation of aluminum giants, each carrying 10 men and 6,000 pounds of high explosives toward the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Then the flak begins. Black flowers bloom in the sky, each a mathematics problem solved by German 88mm guns on the ground. Shrapnel tears through the fuselage with sounds like hail on a tin roof. Except hail doesn't leave jagged holes or turn hydraulic fluid into red mist. Hendricks watches the B-7 to starboard Memphis Bell Jr. take a direct hit to the number 3 engine. The propeller windmills uselessly for 3 seconds. Then the entire NL tears free, tumbling through the formation like a metallic comet. The fortress drops out of formation, trailing black smoke and smaller pieces of itself. Lonesome PCAT shudders from a direct hit, the aircraft lurching sideways as if struck by an invisible fist. Hendricks is thrown against the bulkhead, ears ringing with a frequency that drowns out even the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. When he pulls himself back to the gun, he expects to see fire, to smell the acrid tang of burning aluminum, rubber, and flesh. Instead, the bomber keeps flying. The wings remain attached. The engines drone on with hypnotic thunder. Impossibly, they are still airborne. What Hendricks does not know, what none of the crew knows in that frozen moment of survival, is that the secret keeping them alive was mixed into the very bones of their aircraft months before in factories half a world away. Through a modification so subtle even the maintenance crews barely understood its significance, the Luftwaffe was certain of many things in 1944. They were certain their fighters were superior in design. They were certain their pilots, veterans of 5 years of aerial combat, had skills the young American boys could never match. Most of all, they were certain the B-17, despite its defensive guns and fame as the Flying Fortress, was fundamentally vulnerable. The aircraft was a large target. It flew in predictable formations. It could not outrun the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt 109. German fighter pilots called the B-7s for Motors Vermont and spoke of them with the casual confidence of hunters discussing deer. Major Heinz Baer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 kills, wrote in his combat diary, "The American heavy bomber is impressive in appearance, but conventionally vulnerable. Concentrate fire on the engines or wings. The fuel tanks ignite reliably. The aircraft comes apart in a satisfying manner." This was not arrogance. This was mathematics backed by evidence. In autumn 1943, during the disastrous Schweinfurt-Rig-Ginsburg missions, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-7s in a single day. That meant 600 trained aircrew, 600 families receiving telegrams, 600 empty seats in mesh halls across East Anglia. The loss rate was unsustainable. At that pace, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse under its own casualties before the invasion of Europe could begin. German intelligence officers prepared reports predicting the Americans would abandon daylight precision bombing by spring 1944. They were wrong, but their error was not immediately obvious. It was hidden in maintenance logs and engineering. Specifications written in the dry language of viscosity ratings and thermal properties. It was concealed in the quiet miracle of industrial chemistry in something as ordinary and essential as oil. The problem was older than the war itself. When Boeing designed the B-7 in 1935, they created an aircraft that pushed every boundary of existing technology. for engines producing 1,200 horsepower each. Service ceiling above 30,000 feet range, enough to strike deep targets and return. The aircraft was an engineering marvel, but marvels are built from compromises, and the B-7's compromise was lubrication at 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew their missions. The air temperature dropped to minus 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, normal petroleum oils thickened into sludge. Engines designed to operate with oil at specific viscosities suddenly had to work with lubricant moving like cold honey. The oil pumps strained. The bearings starved. Engine temperatures spiked even as the outside air froze moisture into ice crystals that clogged every intake and frosted every surface. Worse, when the flak hit, and it always did, the hydraulic lines ruptured. These lines carried oil to the engines, to the turbochargers, to the propeller governors. A single piece of shrapnel could puncture a line and dump precious lubricant into the slipstream at 300 miles per hour. Engines without oil lasted only minutes before seizing. An engine seizing at altitude meant lost power, uneven thrust, and a bomber dropping out of formation like a wounded bird attracting predators. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They aimed for the engine specifically, not just to destroy them outright, though that was welcome, but to damage the auxiliary systems, to create oil leaks, to start the countdown to mechanical failure. A B-7 with 2 engines out could theoretically hold altitude. A B-7 with 3 engines out became a glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. German fighters could then circle at ease, choosing angles of attack, saving ammunition, and ensuring the kill. American losses reflected this reality. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 186 heavy bombers. Post-mission analysis showed mechanical failure after battle damage caused nearly 40% of losses. Crews were bailing out of aircraft that were structurally sound but mechanically dead. Engines frozen into useless metal sculptures at altitude. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio studied the problem with growing desperation. The bombers performed as designed. The crews were brave beyond measure. But the oil, simple and unglamorous, was failing at the moment of highest stress. The solution came from an unexpected collaboration. Saxon Vacuum Oil Company, later to become Mobil, had been experimenting with synthetic oil additives since before the war. Their research focused on commercial aviation, on extending engine life for the growing airline industry. But war has a way of speeding up research priorities. What had been a slow investigation into petrochemical properties became a frantic search for a formula that could keep engines alive in combat. The breakthrough involved synthetic polymers, long-chain molecules that maintain viscosity across extreme temperatures. Unlike regular petroleum oils, which thickened predictably as temperatures fell, these synthetic blends stayed fluid down to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. More importantly, the additives let the oil maintain a protective film on metal surfaces, even when most of the lubricant had been lost to battle damage. The technical specification was called ML6082. It was not glamorous. It did not appear in newsreels or recruitment posters. But starting in December 1943, every B-17 leaving the production lines in Seattle, every fortress being retrofitted at maintenance depots across England received the new synthetic oil blend in its engines and hydraulic systems. The air crews were not told. There was no briefing, no announcement. The oil looked the same, smelled the same. Ground crews poured it from drums marked with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to the men who would fly the missions. The change was invisible, done through the huge machinery of military logistics that moved millions of gallons of supplies across oceans and continents without individual soldiers ever understanding the full picture. The evidence built slowly, then all at once. In January 1944, loss rates began to drop. Not dramatically. Men still died. Aircraft still exploded or fell, trailing smoke into German farmland. But the statistical curve bent downward. Bombers that took direct hits to engines kept flying. Fortresses with hydraulic lines shredded by 20mm cannon shells maintained power to their turrets. Aircraft that should have dropped out of formation that should have become easy prey for circling messers, somehow clawed back across the North Sea to emergency landings on English grass. Maintenance officers noticed first. They were used to engines arriving back at base scored and scarred, bearings welded by friction heat, cylinder walls ruined by poor lubrication, but the engines serviced in early 1944 showed different damage patterns. The combat damage was there, the shrapnel holes, the bent connecting rods, the punctured crankcases, but the secondary damage from oil starvation was gone. Engines that had run for hours with significant oil loss had bearing surfaces that, while worn, stayed within operational limits. Statistical officers compiled the data with bureaucratic precision. Mission reports were cross-referenced with maintenance logs. Aircraft serial numbers were tracked against combat encounters and mechanical failures. The pattern emerged in columns of figures in charts plotting survival rates against mission profiles. A B-17, using conventional oil and suffering engine damage, had a 68% chance of mechanical failure before reaching friendly territory. A B-7, using the ML-6082 synthetic blend with equivalent engine damage, had a 31% chance. The difference meant hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men. The Luftwaffe noticed the change, but misread its cause. Fighter pilots reported that American bombers seemed tougher, harder to bring down. Attacks that should have destroyed them instead produced damaged aircraft that stubbornly stayed in formation. Intelligence officers guessed that Boeing had added armor around the engines, or that the Americans had developed self-sealing hydraulic lines. They did not consider oil. Oil was too mundane for tactical analysis. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, a seasoned fighter commander, wrote in February 1944, "The enemy bombers show greater resilience to our attacks. More ammunition is needed per kill. Our pilots grow frustrated. We attribute this to improved defensive tactics and possible structural modifications." The Germans never discovered the truth. Even in detailed technical assessments after the war, when Allied intelligence teams cataloged captured documents and interviewed Luftwaffe personnel, the synthetic oil modification stayed invisible. It was too subtle, too ordinary, too embedded in the normal logistics of warfare, but the crews knew something had changed. They could not explain it technically, but they felt it in the survival rate, in the empty bunks that remained filled, in the odds slowly shifting toward making it home. Rix, the waist gunner from Lonesome PCAT, flew 28 more missions after that January day over Schweinfurt. His bomber was damaged on 16 of those missions. The aircraft returned to base each time, engines smoking but turning, hydraulics failing but sufficient. The invisible chemistry of synthetic lubricants bought minutes and miles and lives. The symbolic object was not a weapon or a ration. It was a drum. A 55-gallon steel drum, olive drab, stenciled with codes utterly ordinary. These drums were stacked in depots across England in warehouses from Bovington to Bassingbourn. Ground crews wheeled them across hard stands in the pre-dawn cold, pumped their contents into oil reservoirs with hand cranks, rarely thinking about the liquid's origin or properties. Yet those drums represented something the Axis could never match. The industrial capacity to innovate at scale, to spot a problem in combat and respond with a solution manufactured by the tens of thousands of gallons, distributed across a continent, implemented universally within months. German factories in 1944 struggled to maintain production under Allied bombing. They substituted materials, simplified designs, cut corners to meet quotas. The idea of developing and rolling out a new oil formulation across their bomber fleet was impossible. American abundance was not just in the number of aircraft built or bombs dropped. It was in the details, in the ability to solve problems other nations could not. A drum of synthetic oil represented research labs in New Jersey, chemical plants in Texas, tanker convoys crossing the Atlantic, supply sergeants tracking inventories, and mechanics pouring golden liquid into engines without knowing they were carrying out a technological revolution. The transformation was as much philosophical as mechanical. Before the synthetic oil modification, the strategic bombing campaign teetered on the edge of failure. The math of attrition favored the defense. Every mission wore down the bomber force a little more. Replacement aircraft arrived. Replacement crews trained and deployed, but the basic equation remained against them. The Luftwaffe could inflict damage faster than the Americans could replace it. After the modification, the equation shifted. Not decisively. Air combat stayed deadly throughout the war, but enough to make sustained operations possible. The bombers could take more punishment. The crews could complete their tour with odds that, while terrifying, were no longer suicidal. The strategic campaign could continue through 1944 and into 1945, grinding down German industry, destroying oil refineries, rail yards, and factories, preparing the ground for invasion. German soldiers and civilians saw the change in the sky. The bomber streams grew larger, not smaller. The attacks intensified rather than waned. Predictions of American collapse proved false. And still the bombers came day after day, engines droning with mechanical persistence, absorbing flak, fighters, and the desperate measures of a nation fighting for survival. To those on the ground, it seemed like inexhaustible American industrial power. They were not wrong, but they never knew how close the equation had come to tipping the other way, or how something as ordinary as oil had prevented that collapse. The epilogue was written in survival rates and empty chairs. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had lost over 4,000 heavy bombers in combat. 26,000 men died in the skies over Europe. These numbers remain incomprehensible, tragic beyond calculation, but the synthetic oil modification is estimated to have cut mechanical failure losses by 35 to 40% in the critical 18 months between January 1944 and the German surrender. That percentage represents roughly 800 aircraft, 8,000 men who returned to bases they might never have seen, 8,000 families who received letters instead of telegrams, who welcomed sons and husbands home instead of attending memorials. Rick survived. He returned to Michigan after the war, worked 40 years in an automotive plant, rarely spoke of his combat experiences. He never knew about the oil. In his memory, he survived through luck, the skill of his pilot, and the defensive fire of the formation. All of these were true, but they were not the full truth. The full truth was that survival in modern warfare often depends on invisible systems, on unglamorous modifications made by engineers whose names appear in no histories. It depends on industrial capacity applied to solving problems that individual courage cannot fix. It depends on a nation's ability to innovate not just in weapons and tactics, but in logistics, chemistry, and the mundane details that decide whether an aircraft makes it home. The B-17 became a symbol of American air power, celebrated in films, photographs, nose art, and combat reports. But its true strength was not in armor or guns. It was in the careful chemistry flowing through its engines, keeping metal surfaces separated by molecular films, preventing friction from becoming fatal heat, buying minutes measured in miles, across the English Channel to the runway threshold, to survival. This is the paradox of modern war. The most critical innovations are often the least visible. That the difference between catastrophic loss and sustainable operations can hide inside a drum of oil. That abundance is measured not just in what can be built, but in the countless details that keep those things working when everything depends on their continued operation. The Germans said the B-7s couldn't survive direct hits. They were correct. According to the physics available to them, they did not account for the physics American chemists had created, for the synthetic molecules that redefined the relationship between temperature and viscosity, between damage and failure, between hitting and killing in the end. The secret was not a secret at all. It was simply invisible. One more line in a logistics manifest. One more drum on a pallet. One more innovation in a war won by the accumulation of such innovations. The crews who flew through the flak never knew they were protected by something as simple as better oil. They attributed their survival to skill, to luck, to prayer, to the rugged construction of their aircraft. They were not wrong. But beneath all those truths was another truth, more ordinary and more profound. That wars are won in laboratories and factories as much as in the sky. That the nation with the capacity to improve its oil formulation while fighting on multiple continents holds an advantage courage alone cannot overcome. and that sometimes the difference between life and death is invisible, flowing through engines at 35 lbs per square inch, keeping the propellers turning, when by all previous understanding they should have frozen still. The oil drums remained stacked in depots long after the war ended. Most were eventually emptied, repurposed, or scrapped. Their contents, revolutionary in 1944, became standard practice in the decades that followed. What was once a secret weapon became simply the way things were done, absorbed into the ordinary progress of technology, unremarkable because it succeeded so completely. But for those 8,000 men who flew missions in 1944 and 1945, who took the hits and kept flying, who made it home against odds that should have killed them, for them, the invisible miracle of synthetic oil was the difference between everything and nothing. Even if they never knew its name or understood its chemistry, their survival was the measure of its success. And their lives were proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that does not look like a weapon at all. It looks like a drum of oil, ordinary and unglamorous, stacked in a depot on a cold English morning, waiting to be poured into engines that will carry men through hell and bring them home again.